Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's opening class. We're going over the Ruy Lopez, or the Spanish chess opening, Spanish game they call it. Ruy Lopez was a Spanish bishop who invented this particular opening way back, I think, in the 1700s. Not sure about that, but he was a Catholic bishop. He liked to play chess, and they named this after him. This is considered the strongest opening for white. If black, you play pawn to king 4, 2 squares, so starts out with this move. This is Bobby Fischer. You know who he is, right? America's greatest player ever, world champion. This was his favorite opening as white. Yes, double king pawn, both sides. And then you bring out the knight. It attacks the pawn. The pawn's not defended, right? So black has to defend the pawn. So he brings his knight out. Now, if the bishop goes to c4, what's the name of that opening? Italian game. This is considered a more complicated, aggressive opening than the Italian game. The Italian game is perfectly fine, and a lot of people like to play it, including grandmasters. They've been playing it a lot the last few years. But Bobby Fischer liked this way. See, the knight protects the pawn on e5. That pawn, black is defending by definition. When you start a game, white moves first. White has the first move advantage. He gets to move a piece, and, well, first he starts out with a pawn. He puts it in the middle of the board. The center squares are the 4 squares right in the middle. So you always move the pawn 2 squares, not 1 when you're white. You grab as much space as you can. When you start out, white has the first 4 rows. That's white's territory. Black's territory are the next 4 rows up the board, but if you're looking at it from black's side, you have 1, 2, 3, 4. That's your territory. Now, the opening phase of a game is they call it development. But what all that means is you bring your pieces from their starting positions at the back row and the pawns, and you put them on the best squares they can go to, toward the middle of the board, so that you control squares. Chess is a game of controlling the squares. The person who controls more squares can push the other guy backwards. And then once you push him backwards and you make him defend his position, you find attacking moves, and you find ways you might win a pawn or a piece. So the opening phase it's like in a war. The generals don't start any action until they mobilize the army, right? You take them from the civilians, you draft them, you train them, you bring them to the front line, then you start. So chess is a war game. You bring your forces, the pieces and pawns, from their starting positions, try to control as many squares as you can, and every move, you move a different pawn and piece, so you get all your pieces developed. You don't move one piece twice in the opening, because if you move this knight here and here, in a way, you wasted a move, because you could have moved this knight here, and you'd have 2 knights out. So your forces would be 2 knights, whereas if you move this guy twice, this guy's stuck back here at home, you see? That's called rapid development. So if you notice, every move is with a key pawn move, grabbing space, and then the pieces come up and grab space. Now, the knight moves here attacking the pawn, this knight moves here. Now the bishop comes here, and it's attacking the knight that defends the pawn. Eventually, white is going to threaten bishop takes knight, and then the pawn's not protected, and then knight takes pawn, wins a pawn. But it doesn't threaten it right now. Let's say white could make another move right this very minute and try to win this pawn here.
Black's move.
It is black's move, but I'm going to give white, as a teacher, an extra move, just to show you what the threat is, that it's not a threat. So imagine bishop takes knight, black takes with this pawn. Why would black take with this pawn and not this pawn? What do you think? What do you think? It does. It opens up this file for the queen. What else does it open up? What else can get out after that pawn moves? This pawn moves here. The bishop. It can come out this way. Now, if he did this pawn, the queen's still stuck behind this pawn, right? And the bishop can't come to the middle. He only can come to the side, and the only square is here, and he'd be behind the pawn here. That would be terrible. So the only correct move is this pawn takes. Now, if this knight takes the pawn, it looks like white wins a pawn, right? But look, the queen can move from here to here, attack the knight that's here, and the pawn that's here. This pawn is undefended. The knight is undefended. The knight has to retreat here, and black can take the pawn with check, getting the pawn back. So the point is, this looks like it threatens to win a pawn, but it doesn't, not yet. Nevertheless, it's still a good move. As soon as white protects this pawn, then bishop takes knight, knight takes pawn becomes a real threat, and black will have to defend against it. So we're going to look at how black does that. Now, there are different ways black can play the Ruy Lopez here, but we're looking at the Chigorin defense, and the key move at this point is a6. And what this does, it drives the bishop back here. Bishops and knights, how many points are they worth in the point system? 3 each. 3 each. A rook is 5. A queen is how much?
Well, a queen is 9.
Right, and a pawn?
1.
Right.
And also a king is 15.
And I would point out that when you say a knight or bishop is worth 3 points,
Sometimes it's worth 3.5.
what's worth 5?
No, 3.5.
Oh, 3.3. People try to, some players over-refine the point system. It's needlessly complicated. Just stick with this simple 3 points for bishop and knight, 5 for a rook. King has no value because if you lose the king, it has value, but they don't give it a point value because if you lose your king, the game's over through checkmate. So there's no point. The point value helps you decide whether to make a trade or not. If you can give up a bishop and win a rook, that's 3 points and you get 5, so you do it. The other thing about the point system is, what you're really saying is a bishop is worth 3 pawns. It's based on a pawn with a point value of 1. And a rook is worth 5 pawns. The other thing is, even though bishops and knights are given 3 points, grandmasters generally consider the bishop to be a little stronger than a knight. So if white takes the knight, that's considered a concession to black, and black can get an even game easier than if white retains the bishop and retreats here. Retreating here, he saves a future threat of bishop takes knight. If he does bishop takes knight, he's given up a piece that's a little better for a knight, and it lets black have an easy equality. White loses the first move advantage. So the next move is bishop to a4. Okay, so black needs to move. Now you typically move your minor pieces, the bishops and knights, out before you can move the rooks, because you can't get the rooks out till you castle one side or the other, and you have to clear out the back row to open up lines for the rook. Now he can't move this bishop, not yet. It's blocked by the pawns. So his choice is he can move that bishop or that knight. Now in this defense, you develop the knight to f6. So notice that the knight, you always bring the knights to the center. You wouldn't go here to the side. A knight on the side of the board can only go to 4 squares. A knight in the middle can go to 8. So if you put the knight on the edge of the board, you're controlling 4 less squares than you would if you put him in the middle. So the chess opening principle is to always put your knights on almost always f6 and c6. Okay, now the other thing to keep in mind is white had a pawn and 2 pieces developed. Black had a pawn and a knight. He also moved this pawn, but this pawn only moved up 1 square, doesn't do much. So black was a piece in development behind. He has to keep pace with white. He has to develop a knight or bishop. He did the knight because the knight attacks the pawn. The pawn's not defended. Whenever you can move a piece into the game and make a threat, that's the move you want to make. Because the threat forces white to at least think about how he's going to defend this pawn. It limits white's choices. Okay, now white is playing very aggressively. He decides not to defend the pawn directly, and he castles. The other thing about openings that you need to keep in mind is every move in the opening has a specific purpose. Every square the pawns and pieces on, grandmasters have determined that they're the best places for those pieces and pawns. If you want to learn the opening, some beginners memorize the first 10 moves. Some might memorize the first 15 moves. It does you very little good. It's more important to know where the pieces go, and even more important to know why they go there. So once you know why the pieces go there, then memorizing the specific move order is much easier because it makes sense. If you just memorize an opening by repetition and you don't know why the moves were made, when you're done with your 10 moves, you don't know what to do. So that's how you should study opening. So anyway, white castled, but he indirectly defends this pawn. If knight takes the pawn, see the rook can move here, attack the knight, and if the knight moves back, this knight can take the pawn. Knight takes, rook takes, knight check. So white really did defend the pawn, and knight takes pawn would be a bad move for black. Castling is considered a development move, just like bringing a knight, bishop, and knight up. So now white's ahead in development by 1 move. Black now needs to he wants to castle too. See how you get the king behind these 3 pawns in the side of the board? It's safe. This is a wall of pawns, and they protect the king. The pawns, and they're protected by the knight. This pawn's protected by the rook. This is very safe. The other thing about castling, the rook comes from the corner here and can move to the middle of the board and support the pawn and make attacks toward the king. Okay, now black needs to catch up. So he develops this bishop here, then he can castle the next move. So the next move is bishop here. Now white moves his rook from next to the king to the e file, the e1 square. It protects the pawn, and there's no longer a possible knight takes pawn. It would lose a piece. Okay, now black needs to make a development move. He wouldn't move the knights. He could move this pawn here. That's a different opening called the Steinitz Defense Deferred. It's perfectly playable. He can move the pawn here. It would protect this pawn and let the bishop out. But the opening we're going through tonight is better than the Steinitz defense. And also, see how the rook protects this pawn. Now white is threatening bishop takes knight, pawn takes, knight takes pawn, and he would win this black pawn. The queen here no longer works because this pawn's protected. The knight retreats, attacking the queen, and the queen has to move and can't take the pawn back. So black, remember he moved this pawn here to push the bishop from here to here, but it also gave black the option of following up with this pawn here, driving the bishop away from the knight, leaving the knight protecting the pawn so white can't win. So that's the move. b5, the bishop retreats, and now black moves the pawn here to let the bishop out this way, but more importantly, this pawn is the key defensive point in black's whole position. Black reinforces this pawn by putting the pawn here, and he has a pawn chain that's very strong defensive setup. So he plays d6. Now, white is the aggressor. There are a number of good moves white could play. He could develop the knight here. Then the bishop, knight, and pawn would control this square. This square is only defended by the knight, so he would have two pieces and a pawn against one. He could plant the knight in here. He could also move the pawn here like black, have the nice pawn chain, let his bishop out. But white, because he has the first move advantage, he's going to adopt a more aggressive position. His plan is to get two pawns side by side in the center. He's going to move this pawn here where it attacks the key black defensive pawn here. But white can't do it right now because black would just do pawn takes pawn, and white would never get his two pawns here. So as a preliminary move, white moves this pawn here, which protects this pawn move, and if pawn takes pawn, the pawn from here takes back, and white gets his two pawns in the center. That's a very aggressive attacking setup. Only possible for white, because white has the first move advantage. So the right move for white is c3. And now white is going to play here. That will let the bishop out, and these two pawns fight for all these squares. It's the most aggressive setup white can do in this position. Now black needs to get his king out of the middle of the board, and he needs to develop this bishop. But where should he put the bishop? If he goes here, white can drive it away with pawn here. He can't, going here is not good. White can just take it and double the pawns, and black would have a pawn weakness. Actually, black needs to defer making a decision about this bishop till later. So black's best move is to castle to get this king out of the middle of the board.
Is there another possibility for the bishop? Maybe there's going to be something.
Yeah, that's possible. And it happens sometimes. But we'll get to that later in the game, okay? Right now, the most urgent thing, this pawn is coming here, and then white can open up the middle of the board with pawn takes pawn. The king doesn't want to be in the middle of the board with a rook headed toward it. King needs to castle, and that's the key move. Okay. So, now I told you that pawn to queen 4 is white's idea with this move, right? It turns out that it's not good for white to play it yet. If the pawn comes here, black has an equalizing move. It leads to complete equality. He moves the bishop here and pins the knight, which defends the pawn. So imagine in your mind that this pawn is here and the bishop is here. Well, I'll show it to you on the screen. So if white plays pawn to queen 4, the right move for black is to pin the knight. Now, The threat in this position is pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. This knight is pinned to the queen. Then it's bishop takes knight. If queen takes bishop, the queen's protecting this pawn. So if the queen takes the bishop, the knight takes the pawn, attacking the queen and bishop. The queen moves, he takes the bishop, and black wins a pawn. That's why this pin is so strong. Now the alternative is white doesn't have to lose a pawn. If it was black's move, he would do bishop takes knight. He doesn't have to do queen, he can do pawn takes. But look, he needs the 3 pawns in front of the king to protect his king. If the pawn goes here, this file is open toward the king. He has a weak king position. He doesn't lose a pawn, and the double pawns are weak. White would almost be lost if that happened. Therefore, before he plays pawn to queen 4, he has to prevent the bishop move. What's the best move for white to prevent bishop to g4? Who would like to hazard a guess about that? Go ahead. H3. That's the key move. That's the main move for white in the Ruy Lopez, and more than one variation, but this is the Chigorin. Now we're at the point where the Chigorin defense actually starts. This is there's 2 major ways to play. The Chigorin defense starts with knight to a4. It drives the bishop. The bishop's in a strong attacking position here and affecting the center square here, and this square, a great diagonal for the bishop. The knight drives it back here. Remember, a bishop is worth more than a knight. White's not going to let black take the bishop. He would lose his best attacking piece. So he moves the bishop here. Now the bishop here is blocked by his pawn. You see that? So the bishop it will take a while for the bishop to get to a good post after retreating here. That's why this is a good move. The other reason, when the knight is back here, I'll put it back. Notice that the knight blocks this pawn. So the pawn can't move here or here. If the pawn was here or here, it would fight for this square or this square. Key center squares. So not only does the knight move drive the bishop back, it frees this pawn to move in the future. That's the major idea. White retreats the bishop. Now black immediately plays this pawn up 2 squares. Notice that now he's fighting for this square. He knows that this pawn is going to move here, and white and black are fighting for this square. He has 2 pawns, but he's not going to trade so much. He's going to keep this pawn here no matter what. There's an option to trade this pawn and open up this file. You're going to see that in the game. The other thing is, by moving the pawns up, look, the queen protects the knight. Remember, the pawn was here. Now the queen can move from here to here and defend the pawns. And once the queen goes here, the bishop moves out, then the rooks can move. So you'll see all that. White carries out his pawn advance, which I told you about. Now he has his 2 pawns in the center. That was his most aggressive setup. Now, white is now threatening to win this pawn. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn. So black defends the pawns by moving the queen up 1 square. And if pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, the queen protects the pawn that's here. In this opening, black maintains this pawn the whole game. This is the key. It blocks this pawn, this white pawn. If this pawn could move up here, it would open up this line to black's king side, and the knight and the queen could come up here and attack black's king. So by keeping the pawn here, it blocks this pawn, which blocks the bishop and keeps white on white's side of the board. Now white's got his pawns the way he wants. He needs to develop this knight and this bishop, which haven't moved yet. So you say, well, should I move the bishop or the knight? What does the audience think he should move?
The bishop.
And where? Well, if you go to E3, that's okay. It protects this pawn.
How about G5?
Where? D5?
G5.
Oh, G5. Well, that's okay, but black hits you with H6. Then where do you move the bishop? Here or here? If you go here, it blocks the queen, protecting the pawn.
Well, I need to know where else to go.
Well, you could go here, but that can be bad. Sometimes black can play here, and the bishop comes here and is blocked by the pawns. The answer is the correct move is to move the knight first, leaving the bishop decision for later on until the position becomes more clear where the bishop should go. That's the same reason black didn't move that bishop. It wasn't clear where the bishop goes yet. So the knight has a clear plan. The knight is going to go here, and in the Ruy Lopez, or Spanish game, the knight goes here. When the knight's here, it's only partly developed. It blocks the bishop. Can't get out. It has to move. They move it down here, and it's got one more move, so it's a 3-move maneuver. They bring it either here or here. They usually bring it here. It frees the bishop, and the knight here protects the key center pawn and prepares to hop up here. And when it gets up here, it attacks this bishop and this pawn and this square. So it's an attacking maneuver, but it takes 3 moves to get where white wants it to go. So the right move is knight bishop to D2. Okay, now black knows that the knight is going to go here, and white's going to start a kingside attack. Black wants to open up some lines on the queen side, and see how the queen is on this file? And the queen's going to attack this bishop. He's going to open up this file by pawn takes pawn. That gives black what they call a counterattack. White is going to attack this way. Black is going to open up the file, move this bishop somewhere, and move a rook here. Rook and queen are going to threaten queen takes bishop. So when your opponent tries to attack you, you have to defend threats, but you also need to find a way to counterattack your opponent. So the right move is pawn takes pawn. White takes back. Remember I told you he moved the pawn here, so he could move here and keep the 2 pawns. He has to take back with the pawn. Now, remember I told you this knight here only has 4 squares, and he has 8. Black moves the knight back here, so he gets the 8 squares. And the knight here protects this pawn and also attacks this pawn and can move here sometimes. So black retreats the knight. That's a good move in this case. I did say don't move it more than once in the opening generally. This is an exception. When the knight moved here, that was move 2, it drove the bishop back. So that was a good defensive move to drive the bishop back. Now that the knight accomplished the purpose with the bishop, he retreats here, and that's acceptable because he helps protect this pawn and threatens this pawn, and he goes back to affecting 8 squares instead of just 4. So chess has rules, and there are exceptions to them. This is an exception to the rule that you shouldn't move the piece more than once in the opening. Okay, now white needs to move the knight. If he goes with his intended move down here, notice that black can take the pawn. Knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, and he can't play queen takes pawn. This bishop would not be protected, and the queen could take the bishop. So knight here can't work for white anymore. He has to change his plan. He moves the knight here, where it helps protect this pawn, and then if black trades this pawn, the knight takes, and the queen continues to protect the bishop. So this is a forced move by white. Knight to b3. Now, black has tried different moves here, but the modern move is this knight defends this pawn, and black can get equality by driving the knight away from this good square. How can black try to drive the knight away from b3? Any ideas? Where? Well, that has a flaw that this pawn could move here, attacking the knight and bishop, and black would lose a piece. Any other ideas? Yeah, comes up here. That's exactly what he does. So this is an aggressive move by black, but it has a good purpose of driving the knight away from a good square. And that's a principle in the opening. You not only want to put your pawns and pieces on the best squares, you want to drive your opponent's pieces away from their best squares. So that's what black's doing. Okay, now he knows he's going to have to move the knight. The pawn's going to come here. He's going to hurry up and move this bishop here to protect the pawn. Then he can move the knight here and not block the bishop in. The bishop will be here, not here. So the knight's behind the bishop. So the right move is to move the bishop out right now and protect that center pawn on d4. Black carries out his threat. Now white can retreat. This is still a balanced, even position. You see, both sides are jockeying for squares and control. White is better in the center with these two pawns, and see how all his pieces are in the center? Black holds the center. He's holding the center. He's not attacking the center. He's trying to develop his pieces to keep up with white, and he wants to move the bishop. Once he moves the bishop here or here, he can move one of the rooks here, and then he threatens knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn takes, bishop takes, and queen takes bishop. That's how black gets threats in this position. Okay, now, so black needs to move that bishop on c8. It's finally time to move the bishop. Where should black put that bishop? Any guesses? Where you were talking about bishop to b7? You can't go here. We talked about the pawn fork. You can't go here. The question now is, which square is better, this square or this square? Anybody care to guess? How about you?
Well, if you put on b7 and you kind of threatens directly center.
This pawn, right? It looks good, but it doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is white moves the pawn here, driving the knight away, and then the bishop is pointing at two pawns and has no future moves. The right move is bishop here, and if the pawn comes here, see how the bishop here guards this square. Remember, this knight's going to go here, here, and here. The bishop guards that square and can take the knight, and if the pawn's here, the bishop can defend this way and move this way and is not blocked by the pawns. Whereas if the bishop here has no moves at all, he's blocked by these pawns and he's blocked by these pawns on the queen side. So the right move is bishop to queen 2 or bishop to d7. Okay, now white has developed all his minor pieces, right? He's castled, he moved his rook to the middle. So he developed this rook. What piece hasn't white developed yet? What do you think? Which piece hasn't moved for white? Okay. Doesn't it make sense to move this where it can do something active? Where should the rook go?
C1 because
it's on a file pointing at the queen, right? And the queen wants to attack the bishop. It defends the bishop. The bishop can move in the future and threaten pawn here. The knight's pinned to the queen. White can threaten to win a piece. So that is the right move. Remember, you bring in all your forces into the game. The one force white has that hasn't come into the game is this. This is clearly the piece to move. And as he said, he can go here or here. This would not do anything. It's behind a pawn. and it blocks the bishop retreating. So this is the only move. And that's what's played. All right, now, black, if you see that there's a rook aimed toward your queen, even if there's a few pieces in between, should you feel good about that, or should be a little uneasy about that if you were black? I would be a little uneasy about it. It might be prudent to move your queen out of the way of the rook. That's called a preventing move. So we're going to do a preventing move with the queen. Now the question is, where should the queen move? Any ideas where the queen should move? Yeah. What are your choices? The black queen. It's lined up on the rook. We don't like that. We need to move the queen somewhere. It can go here, 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 or here. Or here. Which of those squares will you pick? Here? What's it doing up here? Well, it does come down this way, but this knight's defended by the bishop, knight, and queen, so there's not much future here. The right move is to go here, out of the way, but you're pointing on this diagonal. Remember, you said it would be good to put the bishop here, aiming toward the pawn? Well, black kind of goes by that, but instead of the bishop, he puts the queen there. And the queen, notice, protects this pawn. This pawn can't be protected by another black pawn because we move this pawn way up here to drive the knight away, right? Now, if the pawn was back here, it could move here and protect the pawn. So it's important for the queen or some other piece to protect this pawn. So the queen can do two things by moving. It gets out of the way of the rook and protects the pawn. So that's why this move is made. Okay. Now there are no real threats to be made. Remember I told you white wants to move the knight here and here. He couldn't move the knight here earlier because the queen was attacking this bishop. The queen's no longer attacking the bishop, so white can do his maneuver now. That's what he does. He moves his knight over. Now black has all his minor pieces, queen, he's castled. What pieces does black need to activate? What do you think?
Well, the rook.
Yeah, so the question is, which rook should move and where should it move? Any ideas? Yeah, the center. Which rook should go to the center?
I'm pretty sure the egg rook because I'm pretty sure the A rook can find some side job.
You're going to move both rooks eventually, but your rook to the center is the right idea. King rook first. The best place to put the king rook is right behind this bishop. It helps protect this pawn. Remember, this pawn has to stay here the whole game. The rook protects the bishop. The bishop can move out of the way, and then if the rook behind the bishop would maybe threaten pawn takes pawn in the future, opening the rook and knight on this pawn, black would counterattack on this pawn indirectly. He has to move the bishop out of the way to do it, but so that rook to e8 is the right move. F to e8. Now later, he's going to move this rook here to contest this open file. You know what an open file is, right, everybody? It's a file without either white or black pawns on it. A half open file, there's one pawn of white or black, so it's half open to the other side. Anyway, this is completely open. This rook's going to come here and try to trade off rooks and simplify the game. You don't want to let your opponent have an open file with a rook on it without opposing it at some point. Okay, now I told you the knight maneuver, so the knight comes up here. All right, so now the knight, all the minor pieces are pretty much where they're going to be, and this knight is aiming here, but notice we were smart. Black left the bishop here and it guards this square. If the knight comes here, the bishop just takes it, and he wipes out white's piece that finally enters into black territory. Remember, I said this is white, and these are black. So white's finally getting ready to maybe move a piece into black's territory, but black's already defending it. Okay, now, black, okay, remember this bishop is blocking the rook behind this pawn. If the bishop moves out of the way, then black can open up an attack on this pawn by pawn takes pawn, and the rook knight, and if this knight moves out of the way by knight takes pawn, then the queen, knight, and rook attack this pawn, and it's possible that black threatens to win the pawn. So black is going to move that bishop out of the way. This is a case of preference. Black could also move the rook here. They're both good moves. In this particular game, black chose to move his bishop back, and he plays this move. So see how it opens up the rook to this pawn, and after knight takes, bishop takes, the three pieces attack that pawn. He can't win it though, but it builds up a potential threat for the future. Anyway, white is, he wants to, this pawn, he's going to load up pieces on this pawn, which has to be protected by pieces. We're at move 19 in the opening. A lot of opening books stop right here. The evaluation of the game between two grandmasters, it was only a year or two ago, is that the position is even. It's balanced. That doesn't mean it's a draw. It means both sides have chances. White can attack someplace and black can counterattack. And if both sides play correctly, it should end in a draw. But chess, it's very easy to make mistakes, so not that many games end in draws. So anyway, white moves his queen to king 2 or to e2. He's pointing toward this pawn. He's going to move the bishop here, opening up the rook, and the bishop and queen are going to threaten bishop takes pawn. That's the one target in black's position white can aim at. So he starts to aim there. Black's going to make a defensive move. Now with this pawn move, he takes this square away from this knight and bishop so they can't move into black's territory. Purely defensive move. It also gives the king an escape square in the future, if he should need it. He doesn't need it now, but he might in the future. So white moves his bishop up, and he threatens to win the pawn. Black chooses, there are different lines, but black chooses to defend it with rook here. Rook and queen defend the pawn adequately. It's still an even game. The computer, I put this in my computer system. You know, the chess computer, they call them engines that analyze and tell you what moves should be played. The chess computer engines now are better than the world champion. So they're very reliable. The engine said that the grandmaster who played black had a better way to get a completely even game. Instead of rook to bishop 8, the computer says he should move his bishop from here. See, when the bishop was here, the two rooks weren't protecting each other, right? And the bishop kind of blocked the rooks interacting. Now, black is defending. He would like to trade off some pawns and pieces. If he plays here, he's got the knight, the bishop, and the knight, and the pawn all attacking this pawn. And he can trade pieces by knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, bishop takes, pawn takes. He's actually threatening temporarily to win the pawn. So he puts pressure here, and he forces white either to move the pawn here or to take the pawn here. White can move here and drive the knight back, but the knight could go back here and come back by going here and come up here. So black's not worried about pawn here. if white moves here, white gives up forever the ability to take this pawn. Remember I told you this is the key to black's position. So this does gain space because the pawn moves up to the 5th row and is in black's territory, and it opens up space behind the pawns for white. It's not a bad move, but he doesn't want to give up taking this key pawn of black's. So in this line, the computer recommends taking the pawn. The threat was black was going to win the pawn, so he either had to move it or take it. Computer says he should take it. Now black can trade off a few pieces and get an even position. Not with the pawn. See, if he takes with the pawn, he can't trade any pieces. He takes with the knight. The knight here attacks this knight and this bishop. If he gets the opportunity, he'd take the bishop. I told you it's more than the knight. And he can take this bishop now and trade that bishop and get a completely even game, and he simplified things. So the right move is knight takes. White takes with the knight, because white doesn't want to let him take the bishop. Now he takes with the pawn. See, he maintained the pawn here. This pawn came up here. He kept the key pawn that blocks this pawn. So black successfully defended the position. Now they say it's even. I'll show you a few moves. White can do rook up. Then he can bring this rook here and try to control the file, but it doesn't work because black can move his rook over. See how they threaten to trade each other off? White can move this rook over. Black takes, rook takes, and now rook here would be a mistake because the queen has to protect this pawn, and the bishop has to protect this pawn because there are two pieces on it. Rook here would let rook takes rook, and either the queen or bishop would have to take it, and this pawn would be lost. Rook here would be a bad move. A lot of times it's good to trade off all the rooks, but not in this case. The best move for black is to move his king up. I told you it was an escape hole. He moves there. The other thing about that is, if he goes here, rook takes rook, it's not check. So it gives black more options. That's a purely defensive move. And it's even. But going back to this position in the game, black chose rook to b8, which is also leads to an equal game. Not quite as equal as the computer responds. Okay, so here white does pawn takes. Again, knight takes to trade off some pieces. Knight takes, pawn takes. Again, see how black has maintained his pawn here at all costs. And it blocks white's pieces from invading black's territory. And these pawns keep white from doing anything on the queen side. Black actually threatens at some point to move this pawn here, and then his two pawns can advance. White wants to block these pawns from advancing, so he plays this move. Now, he moved it 2 squares, and see how it blocks these 2 pawns? So these pawns can't move anymore. This one could move here, but it would be unprotected here, and white could attack it and win it at some point. So this pawn really can't move here, though legally he could move here. It would be a bad move. He needs to stay here where he's protected by this pawn. So if the pawn stays here, this pawn is blocked forever. It's advantageous to black to maintain equality. Remember, when the pawn moves up twice, black has the option of taking it. Pawn takes pawn en passant. That's the right move. Okay, white takes back, and black moves up here attacking the rook. Rook moves over here. Black moves his bishop to e6, attacking this pawn. He leaves this pawn under-defended. It's defended twice, but it would have been better. Instead of, he should have left the bishop protecting this pawn, and what he should have done was to bring this bishop back here to trade this piece off, completely even game. Anyway, bishop to e6, it's not a real bit, it's just a minor move, bad move. So in chess notation, that's a question mark, exclam, means it's a minor positional move error. It's not, he's not going to lose the game or anything. Okay, now white plays queen to bishop 2, and the computer says the game is still even. We're almost done. Black, this knight here, it can't go here because the pawn's protected. It can't go here. It can't go here. It can't go here. This is no longer a good square for the knight. White has no threats against the king side. He doesn't need the knight anymore on the king side. He's going to move the knight here and move it over here where he has more squares. So he moves it back. Now, black would like to maybe move the bishop here and then move the knight here. White is going to move the pawn here to block this pawn and drive the bishop back. He plays b4. Bishop retreats. Now, black wants to trade that bishop, so black doesn't really mind retreating. White takes the bishop. Queen takes bishop. And now white plays knight to e2. Knight to e2 is the wrong idea for white. Notice the knight here is fairly well placed. It can go here and it protects this pawn. Retreating here, you don't want to retreat we're in the middle game now, we're out of the opening. You don't want to retreat unless you have to. So he voluntarily retreated, and it's not the best move. Well, there's a better retreat, actually. So retreating's okay. The computer says he should go here, because then he can come up to this square, and from here, he can go up here. So he went to the wrong square. Anyway, black now opposes rooks. The knight comes over here, and black moves here. So black defends this square with bishop, knight, and rook, and the knight can't go here. And the rook opposes this rook. The queen and rook adequately protect this pawn. And white retreats this knight. And guess what the grandmasters decided at move 32? What do you think they decided? They agreed to a draw. End of game. The computer says it's completely even. It agrees with them. There's no point. See how white has maintained his 4 rows, but he hasn't penetrated black. Black has maintained his 4 rows and kept white from going up here where white could attack him. It's completely balanced even. Okay, so that's our game as an example of the Chigorin defense. It's still very popular. It's one of the most popular defenses to the Ruy Lopez, even today. And Chigorin invented it around 1895.